Boa tarde a vocês, o público. Ça va? Bom, obrigado pela presença de vocês. Thank you, Robert, Professor Robert Thomson from Strathclyde University, is it? De Glasgow. Ele vai falar hoje para a gente sobre The Global Governance of Climate Change, is it? E eu queria agradecer à professora Angelina pelo convite, para convidar o professor Robert Thomson. Ele vai falar para a gente algo entre 40 e 50 minutos. You have between 40 and 50 minutes, okay? But you feel free. We have nothing against and nothing later to do, so. Aí depois a gente vai abrir para intervenções. Eu acho que 2 rodadas vai ser suficiente. Thank you, Robert, and thank you for being here with us during these tough times.
Well, thank you, Jose. It's a pleasure to be here.
Closer.
Okay. So thanks a lot for coming along today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for your attendance, particularly when there are perhaps at least as interesting things happening in domestic politics that you've come to listen to me talking about global governance. This is a work in progress that I'm going to be presenting to you on, which is a research project that began last summer. And it focuses on the global governance of climate change, and in particular the negotiations in the Paris Conference of the Parties. It was held last December. And behind me you'll see some information about my co-authors. I am Robert Thomson. I'm a professor of politics at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. It's in Scotland, way up in the north of the UK. And my co-author on this particular paper is Frans Stockman. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Groningen. It's in the north of the Netherlands. And we're collaborating with several other people in this project as well. The first in line is Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. He's a professor of international relations at New York University. Detlef Sprints from Potsdam. He's a specialist on environmental law. There are colleagues at a climate change institute in Ciclo, that's in Oslo, Norway. That's in Berlin, yeah. And in this particular project, we were working with senior officials in the European Commission, in particular the European officials who were representing the European Union in the negotiations in Paris. So we worked very closely with them to gather the data. We weren't really working for them. It's an independent academic project, but we were very keen to be engaging closely with policymakers, as will hopefully become clear in the course of the presentation. The overall aim of the project was to compare different methodologies for understanding and forecasting the outcomes of complex negotiations, using different modeling approaches. So the modeling approach that my colleague Frans and I were using is a very kind of European type of cooperative type of model that we're applying. I'll tell you the gist of it shortly. My American colleague, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, perhaps it won't surprise you to hear, he has quite a different non-cooperative type of model of the process. And there was a completely different methodology, which I'm probably not going to talk very much about today, applied by the colleagues from the Norwegian Climate Change Institute, in which their methodology essentially consists of asking experts themselves to forecast what the outcomes would be. To the next slide. So let me tell you just a little bit about talk a little bit about the context of our research project. The context to the Paris negotiations that we're going to be studying here is also important to say a few words about. I guess one of the important contextual facts to know about the Paris talks was that they took place in the shadow of what many people saw, rightly or wrongly, as the failure of the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties some years earlier. So that was generally thought of as being an attempt to reach a global agreement on climate change that didn't work, and indeed there was no global agreement. But there was an agreement of sorts. So there's room for some debate on whether Copenhagen is as much of a failure as many people kind of think it was. But that sort of set the tone for the talks in Paris. There was more of an imperative shared among the negotiators that an agreement had to be reached. And part of that imperative was embodied in an agreement between Obama and President Xi the year earlier to sort of essentially to commit themselves personally to reaching an agreement at Paris. So that was the sort of a more hopeful context in the run-up to Paris, that an agreement would be reached there. Now, our methodology essentially consists of two parts. The first part is essentially a stakeholder analysis in which we systematically describe the negotiation situation. And what does that mean? It means we come up with a stylized representation of who are the stakeholders, what are the issues at stake, what are their positions on the issues, how important are the different issues to the various actors, to describe the essential elements of the inputs into the negotiations. That's part one of our method or research approach. Part two is a set of models of the negotiation. So essentially, you can think of these as being assumptions about the way in which the actors engage with each other and negotiate with each other. And we apply the models to the input data, we apply the models to the stakeholder analysis in order to generate different forecasts of what's going to happen. And then after the event, we compare our forecasts that we made before the negotiations took place with what actually happened to figure out whether any of the models did any good at forecasting what was going to happen. But more interestingly, I think, is which models were relatively better and which were relatively worse, because that allows us to start making inferences about what really happened, what really went on. Now, some people ask me, why do you bother going to all this sort of, go to the trouble of modeling it? Why not just ask people that were there what happened? And that's a fair question. But, and we have tried that to some extent. But the thing is that even very smart people who were there just disagree fundamentally about what happened. They disagree fundamentally about the distribution of power in the system, the extent to which, even the main features of the negotiation process, the extent to which issues were linked to each other. So going and talking to people who were there and trying to find out from them what they think happened is one way to knowledge, and it's something that we try to some extent, but we think that we have to supplement that at least with a more modeling approach, which allows us to make inferences about the key features of the negotiation process that stand alongside but are distinct from the observations and perceptions of practitioners. Now let's talk a little bit about the first part, the inputs. Essentially, we apply a variant of the spatial model of politics, which is, it's an assumption, a way of thinking about political systems that's very widespread in modern political science. It's essentially the idea that we that we think about people who agree with us more as being a bit closer to us, and we think about people who disagree with us as being further away from us. If you buy into that idea as an intuitively plausible way of thinking about politics, then you're already thinking in terms of the spatial model. Now, we apply a particular variant of the spatial model. Some spatial modelers think about conflicts in terms of very abstract ideological dimensions. And we will get to that soon, but our approach to the spatial model is quite specific. We really get into the nitty-gritty of the issues that are being negotiated in Paris, rather than thinking from the outset about very broad, abstract dimensions. Now, the key elements of the spatial model that we apply are the following. We identify the actors, or in this case, the groups of actors who are party to these negotiations. Because we study the conferences of the parties, so these are the yearly set-piece events at which governments come together and try and hammer out an agreement. We recognize that non-governmental organizations play a role in the preparations for these events, but essentially, and this is really the opinion of the practitioners that we've consulted, essentially these events are dominated by governments and groups of governments. So it's an assumption in our analysis that we're only going to be looking at countries and groups of countries, and we don't mean by that NGOs are unimportant. We just mean that when we're studying the negotiations that take place within the conferences of the parties, within Paris, that the main actors we need to consider are the countries, and importantly, groups of countries in this context. So one of the very useful things from a research perspective is the fact that we don't have 192 or whatever the exact number of governments who were at Paris. We don't have 192 separate voices. We have groups of countries who get together and formulate common positions. So even my own country, the UK, Cameron showed up, but does the UK, does a little country like the UK have an independent voice in these negotiations? The UK government would like to tell their citizens that it does, but the reality of these negotiations are that it's the European Union's voice that is channeling its member states' policy demands in this arena. We identify the countries or groups of countries. We identify the main negotiating issues, and we identify the positions of the governments on these negotiating issues. Another key part of our description of the stakeholder of the negotiation situation is the level of importance or issue salience that each of the actors attaches to each of the issues. Can we perhaps move to the next slide? Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the data collection that we conducted, mostly in the summer of last year, prior to the Paris conference. Two sets of experts. So we essentially spoke with a lot of key informants. We spoke with practitioners. I'd say the most helpful to us so far were a group of officials from the European Commission who were, as I mentioned before, the EU's main negotiators in Paris. So they had a very good overview of what the issues were, what the negotiating positions of the various actors were. We were, of course, conscious that this does raise the danger of having a certain sort of Eurocentric bias to the data collection. How did we address that? Well, we addressed it, and I have to emphasize, this is a modestly funded project that's still underway. So we addressed it with our limited resources in two respects. One, we went down into member states to interview officials from a few national delegations. We also went overseas, so I was in China and interviewed people from the Chinese negotiating team. And part of the reason that I'm in Brazil as well is to complement our data collection with some Brazilian perspectives on these negotiations. So next week I'll be in Brasilia to meet with some Brazilian officials who were involved there. We also spoke with expert observers. So our colleagues in the Cicero Institute in Oslo have been attending these conferences of the parties for quite some time, so we drew on their expertise. We drew on specialist journalistic expertise. There's a particular newsletter that follows these negotiations and other international environmental negotiations very, very closely, called the Earth Negotiation Bulletin. And we spoke with some experts who are involved in the writing of that. We also had an online survey of climate change experts from around the world. And in particular, our colleagues from Cicero were consulting a lot of documentation in order to come up with their estimates of the main negotiating issues and the positions of the main actors on these issues. Could we go to the next slide? Okay, so these are, as I said, the first challenge is to identify who are the actors here. We spent a long time, both with our colleagues in the European Commission and with our colleagues in the Climate Change Institute, Cicero, figuring out what is the list of stakeholders here. And we eventually came up with this list of 13. Now you'll notice that some of these are countries and some of them are groups of countries. And the notable thing was that some of the groups of countries, such as the umbrella group, which is a group of countries that, formally speaking, includes the US, Russia, and Japan, as well as some other countries like Kazakhstan. While the umbrella group is a force to be reckoned with, an actor that we have to include in our analysis of the stakeholders, it's not an actor that summarizes well the position taken by the US, by Japan, by Russia, and therefore we have to consider the umbrella group, but take out the countries that are formally members of that group but not well represented by it. So that's a quirk of our stakeholder analysis that we only discovered sort of inductively during the process of interviewing experts and practitioners who were involved in these negotiations. So these are the key actors that we'll be considering. So for each of these actors, we want to know what is their stance on each of the main negotiating issues going into Paris. Let's have a look at the next slide. So this is a hypothesis. You might think about one way of thinking about the distribution of power in the international system would be given by the distribution of these black bars. This is a point of view. These are estimates. These are intuitions given to us by informed observers from our European negotiators and corroborated by our experts in the Norwegian climate change. It's an assumption that I'm going to show you that we test in one of our analyses. But nonetheless, it's instructive. So the way in which informed observers think about, at least a set of informed observers think about the power distribution, is that China and the US hold a great deal of power, the EU somewhat behind, Brazil not much far behind the European Union as a whole, and that's quite remarkable if we think about the relative size of Brazil compared to the EU, the sum of their economic weight, that nonetheless Brazil is more or less on the same level as the EU in terms of its potential to influence other actors and the decision outcome in these negotiations. So even as a point of view, I think that's something noteworthy. Then we have other actors distributed further down the scale. And one of our key questions is, does this really reflect the distribution of power in the international system, or is it the case, for instance, as one European negotiator said to me, these negotiations are really about whether the United States and China rule the world, or whether other countries have any say at all. And that's something that I'll show you that we can at least approach a test of that question with our analyses. The gray bars are estimates of the importance of agreements. Now, I said to you at the start that one of the contextual factors here was that there was a big impetus to find an agreement. It's fair to say that most leaders and negotiators were really committed to reaching an agreement, and that's reflected by the high bars for most countries. But you'll see there were some countries that are groups of countries that were not perceived to be particularly constructive going into the negotiations. So there were potentially some actors, the Arab states and Russia in particular, that maybe they weren't all that keen or all that committed to putting aside their national interest in order to reach an agreement. Let's go to the next slide and see what we've got there. Oh yeah, so that was the analysis of these are the actors. The next stage in our stakeholder analysis was to say, what were the main negotiating issues? And we spent a lot of time thinking about what were the main controversies that had to be resolved in order for an agreement to be reached. And we came up with 13 points of contention. And these 13 points of contention sort of summarize a great complexity of technical issues that needed to be resolved. So it's a model, doesn't capture all of the nuances, but these 13 points of contention do, I think, go some way to capturing the main disagreements that the countries and groups of countries had to resolve in order for an outcome to be achieved. Now, the first one was this overarching sort of framing issue about differentiation. It turns out that for the Brazilian government, at least the perception was that this was the key issue for the Brazilian government. It's really about the extent to which the sacrifices that will have to be made in order to meet the challenges of mitigating climate change and adapting to the effects of climate change, the extent to which these sacrifices have to be shared between developed and developing countries, or the extent to which, if you might look at it from a developing country's perspective, the extent to which the developed countries who caused the problem should bear the biggest brunt of making these costs. Now, so that was an overarching issue of differentiation that kind of framed the negotiations. There were a number of issues under the heading of mitigation, so what we have to do in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. Adaptation, if we're not going to be able to mitigate the climate change, what provisions should the agreement include with respect to adapting to the effects? There were some issues about finance, and there were some issues about the general level of ambition, translated in terms of goals that the agreement would set out. So this, let's take, so for each of these 13 issues, we mapped out the alternative ways in which the disagreement could be resolved. And we mapped them out into a comparable policy space. So we see each of these points of contention as being a policy scale with endpoints representing the most extreme alternatives that could resolve the controversy, and middle points representing the various compromise positions that might be taken. So let me show you this in a little bit of detail with respect to this issue on differentiation. Well, what are the alternatives here? Well, one alternative would be no explicit differentiation. you could say that this was it's probably fair to say that this was the preference of the US government. Yeah, they really wanted to have a broad sharing of responsibility for bearing the costs of mitigating and adapting to the effects of climate change. So we essentially have lots of developed countries at this end of the scale. The other alternative, sort of way down at the other end of the scale, would be a Kyoto-style annex system where you identify a set of countries that does have to bear the costs and a set of countries that are exempt from bearing these costs. And then we have some different formulations that reflect compromise positions. And in the end, we have this particular legality here, which we scored as being a compromise position that's pretty much in the middle between these alternatives. So it's this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in the light of national circumstances. So this is a legal way of finding some way between these different positions that we take. So for each of the policy issues, if we could go to the next slide, we'll see how we map the positions of each of the actors on each of these policy scales. So as I said, the story here is that the US, the EU, and some other, essentially the developed countries are at this side of the scale wanting to share responsibility as widely as possible. And then Brazil, China, Arab states, India are at this end wanting a clearer division of responsibilities between the developed and the developing world. And the least developed countries are sort of closer to the middle of this scale because, well, regardless of how this particular principle was resolved, it's very unlikely that they would have to, they could really be expected to make a great deal of sacrifices. Can we go to let me just say these numbers in parentheses, these are indicators of the level of salience or importance that each of the actors attach to each of the issues. And I'll return to that shortly. I think we're going back the way, forward. Okay, so on mitigation, we had another set of issues. Mitigation, measurement, reporting, and verification. This was essentially an issue about the extent to which countries should be held to account for the commitments that they themselves made, for the actions that they promised to make in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. It's a very sensitive issue, particularly for China, for example, where committing to a system in which you have essentially other countries coming in and checking out whether you are meeting the commitments, that's an issue that really goes to the heart of your sense of sovereignty and sense of your attitude toward foreign intervention in your country. So very, very sensitive issues there. And in fact, a lot of the consensus is that quite a bit of progress was made on this issue in the Paris Agreement. Now we have a framework for developing a system that is transparent with respect to measuring, reporting, and verifying the commitments that countries themselves make in their national plans. Mitigation legal form. This is about a very tricky issue about the extent to which the agreement should be internationally binding. Essentially, the consensus is that the agreement is internationally binding to the extent that international law is binding, because it states that member states shall have put in place national plans and send these to the UNFCCC, which will then engage in a system of ex-ante assessment. So this is really, these set of issues are all about the extent to which member states bind themselves to making commitments and opening up their national systems of policy making to external monitoring, both before and after they've set their plans in stone. Let's go to the next one. So for each of these issues, we did a similar mapping of the positions. Maybe go to the next slide. And we have sort of similar detail on the set of adaptation issues, set of finance issues, and some ambition issues. So for example, adaptation, this issue of loss and damage was particularly important to developing countries, particularly the low-lying island states. And they essentially wanted a system whereby they could potentially be compensated for the adverse effects of climate change, and even receiving some financial compensation. And the agreement there is, it's a little bit of a sort of legal, involves a bit of legal creativity. So there is a separate article on loss and damage, which goes some way to meeting the demands of these particular parties. But then there's an accompanying decision to the agreement which says, but don't expect any money from this. So there's a little bit of legal creativity going on there. Finance, who pays? In the end, we got a climate finance fund with a floor of 100 billion. Obviously, that's not enough for many people. It should be a lot more. The ambition goals, the ambition issues were essentially about how ambitious should the agreement be in terms of stating what should happen by 2050 and what should happen by 2100. And we have quite an ambitious, well, a very ambitious agreement with respect to 2100. It's certainly an important symbol for some of the parties. So for the European Union, it was very important to have an ambitious agreement saying by 2100 we'll have solved this problem. There'll be a balance between emissions and measures to address the effects of these emissions. There'll be a maximum 2% warming of the Earth. That was very important for some stakeholders, but for others, for China, also for Brazil, the general sense was that this was not a particularly important issue at all. So maybe this is perhaps one area where you could say this is more of a European perspective on the issues, and maybe not from the perspective of all stakeholders were these issues that important. So for these 13 points of contention, we've went into some detail in mapping out what the alternatives were or could have been in order to address the difference of opinion. We've identified, I think, as well as we could, using subject area expertise, qualitative subject area expertise from practitioners, from close observers, from the available documentation, on what the positions of each of these stakeholders were on each of the actors, on each of the issues. Now, maybe just go back one, because I need to explain something first. So that's quite a lot of information. I could show you 13 maps of these positions, and you'd be, what's he trying to get at? A key question for understanding any political system is the extent to which there is structure to the positions that actors take. So in many national systems, not in all, we kind of try and summarize political parties' positions on different issues in terms of the left-right dimension. In some countries, you need 2 or 3 or 4 dimensions in order to capture the essence of the political debate. But here's the question with respect to these 13 issues. To what extent can we summarize these 13 issues in a simplified form with a lower number of dimensions? And that's essentially quite an empirical question. The obvious method for answering that question is to run a factor analysis on the positions of these actors on the 13 issues, and that's what we did in the next slide. And what this analysis tells us is that the complexity of the actors' positions on these 13 issues can be summarized pretty well in just 2 dimensions. And that's what these 2 numbers here tell us. These numbers here tell us the proportion of variation in the positions on these different issues that can be summarized by this first factor and then by this second factor. So 48% of the variation can be summarized by the first factor, and 41% can be summarized by the second factor. So that tells us there's something here. But then we have to figure out, what do these factors mean? And that's where we use the factor scores, the factor loadings, to see on which issues each of the factors load. Now, this differentiation issue is one that I said sort of frames the whole debate, so it's not surprising that loads on both factors. But I think the key thing is that this first factor loads on the adaptation issues, and this, as well as some other issues, and this second factor loads mainly on the mitigation issues, as well as some. So for the purposes of just being brief, I'm going to refer to this first factor as being the adaptation dimension, and this second factor as being the mitigation dimension. So in other words, the higher that a country or group of countries scores on this first dimension, the more ambitious it is with respect to its policy positions on adaptation, and likewise for the second factor. Let me go to the next slide and I'll show you what this map looks like. Okay, so essentially here we've plotted the actors in terms of their positions on these aggregate factors. So the further actors are to the right, the more ambitious we think of them in terms of their approach to adaptation. The further up they are, the more ambitious they are in terms of the commitments they want to make in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. So if you think about the further in the top right you are, the more ambitious you are. The LDCs and AOSIS are way up there on the top right. Let's go to the next screen and see if we can make a bit more sense of this. One thing that was notable for me was that the sort of advanced, developed countries are sort of clustered in this top left box, which shows more ambition with respect to mitigation and a bit less with respect to adaptation. But it's remarkable that they're all kind of clustered in this top left box. Brazil just outside it there. Let's go to the next slide. The next thing that I noticed was that, well, sometimes in the media this is portrayed as being sort of a standoff between developed and developing countries. But actually what we see is a great range of positions taken sort of outside of the developed world. So the relatively developed countries within this group, Russia, Brazil, China, are sort of in this corner, and then we have these other countries there. But a great spread. India, I think, is a very interesting position. So if you believe this analysis, what this implies is that the Indian government's positions are essentially all about adapting to the effects of climate change, but doing little to mitigate them. So a point of view that you could interpret as essentially wanting to maintain the current economic model and just sort of adapting to the effects of climate change. In the next slide, another important observation is that, well, the four countries, or groups of countries in the case of the EU, that are commonly identified as being the most powerful are all located around the center. And remarkably, Brazil, right in the middle of this distribution. So one of the reasons I'm here is to figure out, why does Brazil have such a central position in these negotiations? That's a question I have for you all.
What do you expect to mean this position?
Well, essentially,
0 and 0.
Well, it essentially means that this is a position that reflects a very kind of balanced position between adaptation, and mitigation. The zeros don't really have a substantive meaning. It's just,
Okay, but
yeah.
what is this?
It reflects essentially a moderate position on both these dimensions. That's how I would interpret that. So these are the positions. Positions are one thing. And then we have relative issue salience. So as I said, we tried to estimate the relative importance of each of these issues to each of the actors. And I think this revealed some important insights too. We ordered the issues here from left to right in terms of their importance to China. And as I mentioned, this issue of MRV, the measuring, reporting, and verification issue, that was a very important, sensitive issue to China, as was progression and who pays for the climate fund. For Brazil, as I mentioned, this is in the yellow. The top issue, if we had to rank them for Brazil, would be differentiation, this overarching issue. Another notable finding that I'd mentioned earlier was that these ambition issues, they weren't really important at all for China and Brazil. It was a very couple of European issues there. So obviously when we start to think about the dynamics of the negotiations, where you make concessions and where you demand concessions from your negotiating partners, these ambition issues are very easy to make concessions on if you don't really care much about what the outcome is. And that's where we get to part two of the analysis. Now, the particular model that my colleague Franz Stockmann and I are applying and testing in this particular study is the exchange model. And it's a model that's really driven by the assumption that these differences between actors in terms of their issue salience are what drive the process of negotiations. So it takes this intuitively plausible idea that negotiations consist of giving and taking, concessions. You make concessions on issues that are relatively less important for you in return for concessions on issues that are relatively more important for you. Now that's an intuitively plausible idea. It's also very much in line with the qualitative case study evidence that we've read about from case studies of this and previous conferences of the parties, in which they are described as being arenas in which all the issues are brought together. So if you believe the kind of case study analyses, these are big melanges of issues where everything is exchangeable with everything else. But that's our proposition that we can test. And I guess one of the strengths of the modeling approach is that it can take a very simple assumption, intuitively plausible assumption that negotiations are driven by exchange, and then it can work out what the consequences of that assumption are for a real negotiation. So if you were to sort of apply this assumption to all of the issues, the 13 issues, you have thousands of possible exchanges, and the model kind of allows us to work through these exchanges computationally without us having to do the hard work. So it identifies all potential exchanges between each pair of actors and each pair of issues, and it specifies the conditions under which these exchange opportunities exist. So the essence of the model is that actors gradually adjust their positions in a round of negotiations in which they've made an exchange, and then a new round of negotiations opens, and they can, if the structure of the situation permits, engage in further exchanges and gradually shift their positions toward a compromise outcome. Now, we apply two variants of the exchange model. In the first variant, the unrestricted variant, we kind of take this idea of unbridled issue exchange literally. We say actors can exchange any issues they want with each other. So of the 13, if you want to exchange your position on differentiation with finance who pays, go ahead if you can find a good exchange partner who's willing to do that with you. In another variant, we take a more restricted variant of the model, which was really inspired by our qualitative interviews with key informants, where it gradually became very clear to us, even as formal modelers, that things weren't as simple as everyone exchanging everything with everyone. And indeed, the financial issues seem to be dealt with quite separately from the other issues. So we thought, well, let's try a variant of the model in which we put the issues into different bins, into different groups, and we only allow the actors to make exchanges within those substantively related groups of issues. And each of these variants generates forecasts of the decision outcome, and then we can compare the prediction. This is just to give you a sense of what the output of the model looks like. So the actors start off with their initial positions, and the model works through all the potential exchanges. I thought this was a neat one, because this was the issue of differentiation, in which at least one variant of our model says that Brazil's not going to budge from that position at all. I don't really take this particular analysis all that seriously, but it was remarkable that Brazil stayed on its initial position in this analysis, so I thought I'd show you that. But you have a sense of how the model works then. Through shifts in positions of actors, the model generates predictions of what the final positions will be, and then the forecast of the decision outcome is based on these final positions once the model has converged. So that was the exchange model. We did some other modeling as well, which I thought was quite interesting, so I wanted to share this with you briefly. We applied different variants of the Nash bargaining solution, which is a very, very simple model in this context. When you assume that the disagreement outcome is very undesirable, which I think is true for many, although not all, of the stakeholders involved in this, in the Paris negotiations, the Nash bargaining solution is simply the average of the policy positions weighted by actors' issue salience and power. And this variable here is the key one that we want to test. So essentially we load this simple prediction with different assumptions about the distribution of power in the international system, and we check out which model generates the most accurate forecasts, and then based on that, based on the relative accuracy of the forecasts, we make inferences about which assumption concerning the distribution of power is most plausible. So one alternative which I showed you in one of the first slides was this what I call an inclusive regressive distribution of power, where you remember you had US and China up here, the most powerful, the EU and Brazil not far behind, and then the rest. That's one plausible statement, but it doesn't meet this nagging idea that was at the back of the mind of the European practitioner who I mentioned to you, who thought this could just be a big stitch-up. It could just be about the US and China running the world, and we just have to accept it at the end of the day. So what if we load the model with just the US and China's positions? Do we get better, or at least as good or worse predictions of the decision outcome with this assumption about the distribution of power, that it's all held by the US and China? Or do we get a better assumption better predictions when we include a greater range of member states in our assumption about who has power? And we can also play with different assumptions about the distribution of power, more or less inclusive. We can assume that the big four have power, US, China, EU, and Brazil. The big three, US, China, EU only. Or we could say it's the hegemon. The US has all the power. And it's really an empirical question, which of these models is most accurate? So the results fall out pretty neatly. I'm going to just tell you the results in words rather than show you lots of tables. I'm happy to share the tables with you as well if you want. The restricted exchange model, so that's the one that assumes that exchange is not really that widespread. That gives the most accurate forecast of all of the ones that we consider. And despite the fact that we have very modest number of observations here, only 13, it's significantly more accurate than the unrestricted exchange model. So this idea that the conferences of the parties are venues in which all issues can be exchanged with each other is not really supported by the evidence at all. The other main assumption, the other main finding is that the Nash bargaining solution with the inclusive assumption, so the assumption that power is dispersed quite widely in the international system, it's not only held by the big two, the big three, the big four, but held very widely, that is the model that generates the more accurate forecasts. And the more that we assume that power is held by just one or a few, the worse our predictions get. I have some concluding comments on the next slide. So to kind of bring all this together, what we observe is a highly structured political space. So like 90% of the variation of the positions of the stakeholders on these 13 issues can be summarized in the two-dimensional picture that I showed you. And that, when you have a very structured political space, that says something quite fundamental about what type of political system we have and we have emerging at the global level. Also quite notable is the fact that the most powerful states and groups of countries are located toward the center of that space. So when you have a structured political space where the most powerful are located at the center, you could reasonably hypothesize, I think, that these are the conditions that you need for centripetal decision-making. So decision-making where outcomes are located close to compromise positions around the center of the political disagreement, the political space, rather than being at the extremes. So the fact that we have results that imply that power is distributed widely, this, I think, provides some evidence for the idea of multilateralism. Not the idea that, everyone is equal, but that power is dispersed beyond the largest, most obviously powerful countries. And finally, this idea that issue linkage is perhaps not as widespread as some of us thought in these negotiations, which makes a lot of sense when you learn more about how these negotiating teams are structured, where you often have quite big negotiating teams who deal with different parts of the agreement. And for example, you have a separate unit within many negotiating teams dealing with the finance issues. And they don't always talk to the folks who are dealing with the mitigation issues and the adaptation issues, even within the same country, the same large delegation. So that sort of indicates that these political structures within negotiating teams are also relevant, but that also has implications for what happens at the global level. So, just a few words about next steps for this research project. As I said, one of the reasons I'm here is to get more Brazilian perspectives on these negotiations. In addition, we want to look back and forward in these negotiations. So one of the things we'd like to do is to compare what happened in Paris with what happened in Copenhagen. And the big question is, well, why is there relatively more progress in Paris compared to Copenhagen? What is really the difference? And also looking forward in terms of, well, what do we do with the outcomes of Paris? How will they be implemented? And how will some of these somewhat ambiguous parts of the Paris Agreement, how will they be articulated in subsequent rounds of the conferences of the parties, say, in the next one in Marrakesh later this year? So thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to any comments you have. Thanks.